Hey.
My name's Dave Schroeder, and I'm the Director of Jazz Studies at New York University, and I'm glad to welcome you all here to the Masterclass series from NYU. Right now, I'd like to invite someone up here to speak about a little background and historical information about Mr. Barry Harris, author and music critic and author of the new book, Weatherbird, Jazz at the Dawn of Its Second Century. I'd like to have you welcome Mr. Gary Giddins. Okay, Gary.
This is a great experience to hear these musicians, and as I said, I'm delighted to be a small part of it. Now, Barry Harris is a man of parts. How many of you were here the last time for Cecil Taylor? One of the themes of that day absolutely is applicable today and to all of the musicians in this series, which is the absolute lack of compromise, the almost inability to compromise on the part of these artists. Barry Harris is a musician who's worn a number of hats, and maybe we can talk about him by sort of listing them. Let me say, first of all, he was born in 1929, December 15th, I think, so he's going to be 75. And that means he was born 9 years after Charlie Parker. So he's part of the early generation of musicians to inherit the innovations of the bebop masters. And as I think most of you know, jazz is filled with pockets and movements of musicians that come out of particular periods at a particular time. Everybody knows about the New Orleans at the turn of the century and the Chicago movement. And Barry was part of a post-war movement in Detroit. And it was an extraordinary group of young guys who were meeting each other, came from different areas in Michigan, and including the Jones brothers, Thad, Elvin, and Hank. The guitarist Kenny Burrell, incredible pianists. In addition to Hank Jones, Tommy Flanagan, Roland Hanna, wonderful blues-playing jazz pianist who you don't hear much about anymore, named Hugh Lawson, who used to work with Yusuf Lateef a lot, and of course Barry. And Barry immediately got a reputation because a lot of musicians, they may live in New York or California. When they go on tour, if they're successful, if they're Dave Brubeck, they bring their own group wherever they go, Miles Davis. But a lot of musicians are just their names, and they can't always afford to bring a full band. So they use pickup groups. I'll probably repeat this when he's here, but when Clark Terry and Bobby Brookmeyer did a pickup gig once, and I won't mention any of the musicians involved, but it was a hotshot trio from a local town. And I'll never forget afterwards, Clark walked over to the pianist and he shook his hand and he said, "Don't think it hasn't been a gas just because it hasn't." So they came to Detroit, and a lot of times Barry would sit in, or they'd get to hear about Barry because people would talk about him, and suddenly he was sort of a national legend in his 20s. You know about this guy in Detroit, Barry Harris? So inevitably, somebody was going to bring him to New York. He played with everybody out there. He played with Miles Davis. He played with Wardell Gray. So many musicians of different periods who were passing through. Well, it was Cannibal Adderley who convinced him to leave Detroit and come to New York, and he brought him into his quintet in 1960. He immediately became an important part of the New York scene. Now, this is interesting. It's always fascinated me, and I think we'll talk about it later on. But the thing that really sort of put Barry over was he had an engagement for about 4 or 5 years working with Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins is one of the people who invented jazz. He's one of the great patriarchal figures. So here was a guy who was so completely associated with the bebop period, or bebop as a style, working with one of the people who was often said to have helped invent it, but from something of a distance. He was recording in the early 1920s. And they had a tremendous association for 4 or 5 years, many recordings they made. And I remember seeing them as a kid. I think I was 15 or 16 at the Village Vanguard on the same bill as Sonny Rollins. And he started to record under his own name, made a tremendous series of records for Prestige and then Xanadu and Riverside, many other labels. So having given you a little bit of history at the beginning, let's talk about some of the contributions, some of the hats he wears. First of all, pianist. great jazz pianist, one of the great jazz pianists of the post-war era. Uh, a musician who's known for the extraordinary clarity of his improvisational style. He does not waste notes. He plays with extraordinary precision and eloquence and melody. His melodic line is always easy to follow because there's no clutter. He has a great sense of melody, and he finds beauty in places where you don't always expect to find it. Another unforgettable evening was, I guess, in the 80s at the Village Vanguard when he had his trio. And he started playing this tune, and I remember I was at a table that included some musicians and writers and his producer at the time, his record producer, and he was playing this tune, and it was familiar to everybody, but nobody could place it. It was just one of those nagging, what the hell is that? And then somebody said, it was like on a stage whisper, "I Love Lucy." And it was the theme to the I Love Lucy show, and it wasn't a joke. After everybody sort of laughed in recognition, he turned it into this gorgeous ballad, and he played it for a number of years after that. He has a tremendous taste and tremendous loyalty to the music of the musicians he most loves and has played really all his career. Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, who really invented the modern piano style, along with Monk. Barry takes elements of all of that and turns it into his own very melodic, very focused, very eloquent style. In addition to being a pianist, and this is not quite the same thing, he's also I would say, a leading conservator, if not the leading conservator of the bop style. All kinds of musicians are always being tempted to do something for a few extra nickels. In the 1970s, almost every pianist you could think of was forced to play a Fender Rhodes at one time or another. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Fender Rhodes if that's your music, if that's what you want to play. But if you're doing it and you hate every moment of it, it can really be irritating. Keith Jarrett says it makes him sick to his stomach to this day to think of what he played on the Fender Rhodes. But everybody had to try it because it was an in thing. Bill Evans did it, John Lewis. I think Barry is the only guy I can think of, maybe Hank Jones too. Never went away from his kind of playing. I started writing in 1973 for the Village Voice, and the first piece I did was about 2 records, Art Tatum and the Hot Lips page. But the second piece I did, the first piece I did about a live performance, was Barry at a place called Jimmy's, a bar on 52nd Street. It was a kind of businessman's hangout that was founded by 2 former members of the Lindsay administration. And it was a kind of in place. And they had a piano in the middle of the room and a bar, and it was always jammed. And Barry was playing. And there would always be music fans who would go there to hear him. But you'd have to put up with an awful lot of conversation. This was not a concert hall. This was a bar where people mostly went to, pick each other up, as it were. So one night, there's a table of fat cats who were talking, and they put together a whole bunch of money. They just chip in a lot of money, dollars, fives. And one of the guys picks up, and he walks over to the piano, and he says, "Would you please not play, because we're having a conversation." And Barry picked up the money, and he said, "I will not stop playing." Threw the money back at them and went and finished his set. That's Barry Harris. Now, so in all these years, he's the guy who's really always kept his music pure. You go to hear him at the Vanguard, you always hear him with musicians who really understand this music deeply, and they don't need to do anything to gussy it up. They keep it alive because it is alive. And they keep it, as I said, pure. Now, to extend the role of a conservator and a great pianist and composer and band leader and recording artist and all of that, he's also been one of the most unusual teachers of jazz in memory, certainly that I know of in jazz history. He has had master classes. There was a period when there was no singer that you could go see in New York who didn't start out in one of Barry Harris's classes. I mean, that was the first thing they would say. He would put on concerts. He was reminding me a few minutes ago that I once described one of these concerts as Barry Harris and a cast of thousands, where he did these annually at big theaters, and he would have choirs of singers and big band and dancers, and it was like, I don't know, some kind of inspired jazz vaudeville where it was changing every few minutes, and yet there was such a feeling of family on the stage, and it was utterly contagious, so that the sense of family completely extended to everybody in the audience. And you felt like you had been at something privileged, a party, something private almost. And everybody would walk out with, radiant smiles, and nothing like it would happen again for another year until Barry would bring one of these shows back. His generosity to students is legendary. He has taught so many people from the keyboard on whatever instruments they play, as well as so many singers. And he's not only taught them privately, but using these concerts, he allowed them to get the experience of being on stage in front of an audience. And he keeps on doing it. There are very few artists that, when they go to the Vanguard, or when they don't play often enough as far as I'm concerned. Johnny Griffin, the great saxophonist who moved to Europe, I don't know, almost 4 decades ago. He had a comeback in the 70s because he hadn't played here in a long time. And there was a lot of talk and articles and huge things, big record deal. And I was talking to him once, and I asked him how he liked, just decamping and moving to Europe. And he said the difference between Europe and America for a jazz musician is that in America, they're glad to see you once a year. In Europe, they're glad to see you every day. And so when Barry does come to the Vanguard with a trio, or sometimes with a quartet, a guitar, sometimes with a large group saxophone, there is a beauty to the music. There is no conversation. There's just a kind of mutual participation in the pleasure of seeing a master musician playing great tunes, always great tunes. If they weren't great before he started playing, they become great in his interpretation. And played with a privileged understanding and intensity and love of the music that these geniuses created just at the time he was growing up. Bird, Bud, Monk. He is their living heir. Please welcome Barry Harris.